The year is 1570. In the frozen hills outside Novgorod, a bell rings one final time across a valley that will never hear it again. Inside the convent of the Intercession, 43 women kneel in prayer. Their lips move in unison, forming words they've spoken every morning for years. The Jesus prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. But this morning, the words taste different, like ash, like goodbye. Mother Euphrosyne has led this convent for 23 years. She survived the Great Famine of 1557. She buried 11 sisters during the plague of 1566. She watched 2 metropolitans come and go, but she has never felt the cold quite like this. Outside, the world has gone silent. Even the wind has stopped, even the crows. And then she hears it. Hoofbeats. Thousands of them, rising from the frozen earth like the drums of Judgment Day. The oprichniki didn't ride. They descended, like ravens, like plague, like the wrath of a god who had forgotten mercy. Black robes against white snow. 6,000 men who answered to no law, no church, no conscience, only to him, only to the Tsar who called himself the Hand of God. The dog-heads meant they would sniff out treason. The brooms meant they would sweep it away. Every man among them had sworn an oath. I swear to be true to the Lord Grand Prince and his realm. I swear not to eat or drink with the Zemshnia, and not to have anything in common with them. They had renounced their families, their friends, their very humanity. They existed now for one purpose only, to destroy whoever the Tsar deemed an enemy. And today the Tsar deemed an entire city, and everyone in it, an enemy. Inside the convent the women have stopped praying. They crowd at the narrow windows, breath fogging the ancient glass. Sister Xenia, barely 17, asks a question no one can answer. Mother, why are they coming here? We have nothing. Mother Euphrosyne doesn't answer, because she knows the truth that Sister Xenia is too young to understand. They didn't want what the nuns had. They wanted what the nuns were. What Ivan the Terrible did to these women wasn't just conquest. It wasn't just violence. It was theatre, a performance of power designed to break something that swords alone could never break. What happened next wasn't written in any history book you studied in school. It was buried, erased, scrubbed from the record by 500 years of silence, until scholars began to dig. In the Synodicon of the Disgraced, a list Ivan himself kept of everyone he murdered, there are over 3,000 names. Bishops, princes, children, and among them hundreds of entries that say simply monks and nuns of, followed by the name of a monastery that no longer exists. These women were erased so completely that for centuries we didn't even know they were missing. But the archives don't lie, the bones don't lie, and the testimonies of the Germans and Italians who witnessed the aftermath, they don't lie either. Here on the Hollow Throne we excavate the darkness history tried to forget. Every view, every subscription helps us pull one more voice out of the silence. Now let's go back to that convent, because the bell has stopped ringing, and the doors are about to break. To understand what happened to these nuns, you need to understand the man who destroyed them. And to understand that man, you need to understand the child he once was. Ivan Vasilievich was born in 1530, the son of Grand Prince Vasily III. He should have been a prince like any other, raised in luxury, prepared for power, surrounded by people who loved him. Instead, his father died when he was 3. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, became regent. She was poisoned 5 years later, almost certainly by the boyar families who wanted power for themselves. By the age of 8, Ivan was an orphan in a palace full of predators. The boyars treated him like a prop. They dressed him in rags. They let him go hungry while they feasted. They murdered his friends in front of him. His childhood nurse, Agrafena, the only person who showed him kindness, they dragged her away to a convent, and he never saw her again. Years later, Ivan would write about his childhood in a letter to Prince Kurbsky. My brother Yuri and me they brought up like vagrants and children of the poorest. What have I suffered for want of garments and food? The neglect bred paranoia, the powerlessness bred rage, and the rage bred something darker, a conviction that the only way to survive was to become the most terrifying thing in the room. At 13, Ivan had his first taste of power. He ordered Prince Andrei Shuisky, one of the boyars who had tormented him, arrested and thrown to a pack of dogs. The boy had learned his lesson. In a world of wolves, you either become a wolf or you become meat. In 1547, at 16 years old, Ivan crowned himself Tsar Caesar, a title no Russian ruler had ever claimed. He wasn't just a prince anymore. He was, in his own mind, the earthly representative of God himself. And God, Ivan believed, did not forgive, God punished. For the first 13 years of his reign, Ivan was, by the standards of his time, a reformer. He convened councils, he revised the legal code, he conquered Kazan and Astrakhan, expanding Russia to the Caspian Sea. He married Anastasia Romanovna, and by all accounts he loved her. She was his anchor, the one person who could calm his rages, who could remind him that mercy was not weakness. Then, in 1560, Anastasia died, probably of illness, but Ivan was certain, absolutely certain, that she had been poisoned by the boyars. Modern forensic analysis of her remains found elevated levels of mercury. Whether it was medicine or murder, we'll never know, but Ivan knew. In his mind, the boyars had taken the only person he ever loved, and he would make them pay. He would make everyone pay. 4 years later, in 1564, Ivan did something unprecedented. He abandoned Moscow. He loaded his treasury onto wagons, gathered his most trusted men, and simply left. He sent a letter back to the boyars announcing his abdication, claiming they had betrayed him, that he could no longer rule a country of traitors. The boyars panicked. Without a Tsar, there would be chaos, civil war, invasion. They begged him to return, and Ivan said yes on one condition. He demanded absolute power, the right to execute anyone he deemed a traitor without trial, without appeal, without mercy, and he demanded his own kingdom within the kingdom, a territory called the Oprichnina, where his word was the only law. The desperate boyars agreed. They had no choice. They had just handed a madman the keys to hell. The Oprichnina was not just a territory, it was not just a policy, it was a religious cult with Ivan as its abbot, at Alexandrov Sloboda, 120 kilometers from Moscow. Ivan built his dark monastery. He selected 300 of his most loyal oprichniki to live with him there, and he organized their lives like monks. Every morning at 4 o'clock, Ivan himself would ring the monastery bells, assisted by his chief executioner, Malyuta Skuratov, who served as his sexton. The oprichniki would file into the chapel in their black robes. They would pray for hours. They would sing hymns, Ivan would deliver sermons about sin, about punishment, about the divine right of the Tsar to cleanse Russia of corruption. And then after morning prayers they would go to work. Their work was torture. Their work was execution. Their work was the systematic destruction of anyone Ivan deemed disloyal, and in Ivan's paranoid mind that was almost everyone. A German adventurer named Heinrich von Staden served as an oprichnik. Years later, he wrote about what he witnessed. Every day he arose and moved to another monastery. He indulged his wantonness and had monks tortured, and many of them were killed. There are 300 monasteries inside and outside the city, and not one of these was spared. Not one was spared. Not the monks, not the nuns, not the abbots or the abbesses or the novices who had taken vows only months before. And this wasn't random violence, this was theology. Ivan had convinced himself that he was doing God's work. Here's what makes Ivan different from other tyrants. He believed, truly believed, that suffering was holy. In 16th century Orthodox theology, the torments of hell were real: fire, ice, drowning, being torn apart. And Ivan, who read scripture obsessively, who could debate theology with trained scholars, came to believe that he was God's instrument on earth. If hell was real, and if sinners deserved hell, then why wait? Why not give them a taste of divine punishment now, while they could still repent? Drowning, burning, freezing, impalement, boiling alive. Ivan didn't see these as cruelty. He saw them as mercy, giving sinners a chance to suffer in this life, rather than for eternity in the next. He wrote letters to the monasteries he had destroyed, explaining his reasoning. He sent donations, gold, land, livestock, along with instructions that the monks should pray for the souls of those he had killed. He kept a book, the Synodocon of the Disgraced, where he recorded the names of his victims so they could be remembered in prayers. 3,300 names in the surviving fragments alone, and the real number. Historians estimate tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, when you count those who died from starvation and exposure after their villages were destroyed. This wasn't a man who killed despite his faith. This was a man who killed because of it. But why target the church? Why destroy the very institutions that were supposed to support his divine rule? Because the church was the only power in Russia that could challenge him. Monasteries controlled vast amounts of land. Some estimates suggest up to a third of all arable land in Russia belonged to the church. They had wealth. They had loyal followers. They had moral authority that even a Tsar had to respect. And they had leaders who dared to speak against him. In 1568, Metropolitan Philip, the highest-ranking clergyman in Russia, publicly refused to bless Ivan during a church service. Philip had been Ivan's friend once. They had grown up together. Ivan had personally asked him to become metropolitan, but Philip had accepted on one condition, that Ivan abolish the oprichnina. Ivan had agreed. Then he had broken his promise. So when Philip saw the oprichniki in their black robes entering the cathedral of the Dormition, the holiest site in Russia, he did something no one had ever done. He refused to give the Tsar his blessing. "I do not recognize the Tsar in these strange garments," Philip said. "I do not recognize him in the deeds of the realm. Fear the judgment of God, O Tsar." We are offering here a pure and bloodless sacrifice to the Lord, but behind the altar the blood of innocent Christians is being spilled. The cathedral fell silent. No one breathed. Ivan's response was quiet, controlled, terrifying. "Be silent, Father," he said. "Just be silent, bless us." Philip replied, "My silence puts sin upon your soul and brings death." Within months, Philip was arrested on false charges of sorcery. He was stripped of his vestments during a public liturgy and dragged from the altar. He was imprisoned, starved, chained. And then, in December 1569, as Ivan marched toward Novgorod, he sent Malyuta Skuratov to visit Philip in his cell at the Otrok monastery in Tver. Malyuta knelt before the metropolitan and asked, with feigned reverence, for his blessing for the Tsar's campaign against Novgorod. Philip looked at his executioner and spoke his final words. "Do what you will, but you will not obtain God's grace by deceit." Malyuta strangled him with a pillow. When he emerged from the cell, he told the abbot that Philip had died of the heat. "If you're still watching, it's because you know this story needs to be told. Not for us, for them, for the voices that were silenced, for the crosses that were shattered. Subscribe to the Hollow Throne. Help us keep the past alive." With the metropolitan dead, the one man who might have stopped him, Ivan marched on Novgorod. His excuse was treason. Someone had brought him a letter claiming that the Archbishop of Novgorod, Pimen, was plotting to deliver the city to Poland. The letter was almost certainly a forgery. But Ivan didn't care about evidence. He cared about control. Novgorod was different from Moscow. For centuries it had been a republic, governed by elected councils, not princes. Even after Ivan's grandfather had conquered it, Novgorod retained its independent spirit, its wealth, its pride. Ivan decided to break that spirit forever. In late December 1569, Ivan set out from Alexandrov-Sloboda with an army of 1,500 musketeers, thousands of oprichniki, and his own son, also named Ivan, at his side. But they didn't go directly to Novgorod. First they stopped at every town, every village, every monastery along the way. At Klein, they began the killing. At Twer, they destroyed everything. Churches were stripped, treasures were stolen. Prisoners were taken, bound, stripped naked, and rolled in the snow until they died. When the frozen bodies piled up, they cut off the legs so the corpses could be shoved under the ice of the Volga River. Heinrich von Staden, our German eyewitness, was there. Neither church nor monastery was spared here. The Grand Prince arrived again outside the city of Great Novgorod. By the time the army reached the outskirts of Novgorod on January 2, 1570, they had left a trail of devastation 300 miles long, and they hadn't even started yet. Ivan's advance regiment arrived first, 4 days before the Tsar himself. They had one order: seal the city. No one in, no one out. Every road was blocked. Every gate was guarded. Anyone trying to flee was killed on the spot. But before they sealed the city, they sealed the monasteries. There were over 100 monasteries and convents in and around Novgorod, centers of learning, of charity, of prayer. Many had stood for centuries. Some dated back to the earliest days of Russian Christianity. The oprichniki looted the treasuries first. Gold, silver, precious icons, jeweled crosses. Then they rounded up the monks and nuns, nearly 500 of them from the surrounding monasteries, and brought them into Novgorod. They were held there under guard while Ivan prepared for his arrival. On January 6, 1570, the Tsar entered Novgorod. His first command, issued before he even entered the city walls, was simple: beat the monks and nuns to death with clubs. The convents around Novgorod held women from every station of life. There were princesses who had been forced to take vows when their families fell from favor. This was common practice, a way to remove women from the line of succession without the scandal of murder. There were widows who had nowhere else to go. There were young women who had chosen the religious life out of genuine devotion. And there were survivors, women who had fled to the convents after their families were destroyed by earlier waves of Ivan's terror. The records don't give us their names. The Synodokon of the disgraced refers only to nuns from the monasteries of Novgorod, anonymous, interchangeable, already half erased. But we know some things. We know the convents they came from. We know the saints they prayed to. We know the lives they had built in those stone walls, lives of prayer, of service, of quiet devotion, and we know what was taken from them. In the convent of the Intercession, Mother Euphrosyne had perhaps an hour, maybe less, between the first hoofbeats and the breaking of the doors. She didn't panic. She had lived through too much for panic. Instead, she gathered her sisters, 43 women who had trusted her with their lives, their souls, and she led them to the chapel. They would not hide. They would not run. They would meet whatever came as they had met every trial in prayer. "Sisters," she said, and we can imagine her voice steady despite the approaching thunder, "we have given our lives to Christ. Now we may give our deaths. Whatever happens, do not be afraid. He is with us. He has always been with us." Sister Xenia was 17. She had taken her vows only 6 months before, after her entire village was destroyed by a different wave of oprochniki. The convent was supposed to be safe. The church was supposed to be untouchable. Sister Pelagia was 72. She had outlived 3 Tsars. She remembered when the bells of Novgorod rang for joy, not warning. Sister Martha had been a princess once, before her husband was accused of treason and executed. She had come to the convent to escape Ivan's court. She had thought she was finally beyond his reach. They prayed the Jesus prayer together, over and over. Gospodi Jesusa Christe, Syna Boshi, Pomilui Maya Greshnago. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. The doors burst open. Here's what might be the most disturbing detail of all. The oprochniki kept records. They entered with ledgers, with quills, with ink pots. They counted the nuns. They recorded their names, or didn't bother, listing them only as numbers. They inventoried the convent's possessions. How many icons, how many silver candlesticks, how many gold threads in the vestments. This wasn't a massacre, it was an audit. The oprochniki had perfected the art of organized destruction. They moved through the convents like clerks, not conquerors, cataloguing everything before they destroyed it. One of them probably wrote, in neat script, something like, Nuns, 43, icon of the Virgin, gold-plated, candlesticks, silver, 12, bells, bronze, 3, and then, beneath that inventory, disposed. On January 7, 1570, the day after the Tsar arrived, the order was carried out. Nearly 500 monks and nuns from the monasteries surrounding Novgorod had been rounded up over the previous days. They were brought to a gathering point, their hands bound with rope. Some had been forced to walk for miles through the snow. Some were elderly, some were sick. At least one chronicle mentions a nun who was carried by her sisters because she could no longer walk. They were made to wait, hours perhaps, while the oprochniki prepared, and then the killing began. Ivan's order was specific. They were to be beaten to death with clubs, not swords, not axes, clubs. This wasn't a military execution. This was punishment, degradation, a message to anyone watching that these people, these brides of Christ, were worth nothing. The chronicles don't describe what happened in detail. Perhaps that's a mercy, but Robert Payne, one of Ivan's most thorough biographers, reconstructed the scene from multiple sources. His first command was that all the abbots and monks who had come from the outlying monasteries should be beaten to death with clubs. The mangled bodies could be returned to the monasteries for burial. Abbesses and nuns shared the same fate. The bodies, what was left of them, were loaded onto carts and returned to the monasteries they had come from, not out of respect, out of efficiency. The oprochniki didn't want to waste time digging graves. But here's what the oprochniki didn't understand. Here's what Ivan, for all his theological posturing, never grasped. The nuns didn't break. Eyewitness accounts describe something the executioners found unnerving. The women kept praying. As their sisters fell around them, as the clubs rose and fell, they continued the Jesus prayer, Gospodi Jesusa Christe. Some of them sang the ancient hymns of the Orthodox Church. Songs of resurrection, of hope, of a kingdom beyond this world, rose from the condemned, even as they died. These women had spent their entire lives preparing for suffering, fasting, vigils in the cold, hours of silence, submission to something greater than themselves. What the oprochniki saw as torture, the nuns saw as the final test of their faith, and they passed it. One of the oprochniki, years later, according to a much-disputed account, told his grandson about the women who sang themselves to death. He said he still heard them sometimes, in his dreams, in the wind. He said he never forgot the look in their eyes, not fear, not anger, but something else, something that made him feel, for just a moment, like he was the one condemned. Ivan didn't watch the killing of the monks and nuns, but he knew exactly what was happening. He had ordered it. He had specified the method. And the next day, when he entered the city for Mass at the Cathedral of St. Sophia, he did so with the blood of 500 religious men and women fresh on the snow. The murder of the monks and nuns was just the beginning. What followed was 5 weeks of systematic terror. But before we continue, I need you to understand something about Ivan's psychology, something that makes everything that happened next even more disturbing. The next morning, after ordering the death of 500 holy men and women, Ivan went to church. He heard the divine liturgy, he took communion, he prayed, and then, according to multiple chronicles, he dined with Archbishop Pimen, the very man he suspected of treason. They ate together like old friends, until, in the middle of the meal, Ivan gave a signal. The oprochniki seized Pimen. They stripped him of his vestments, they put a common peasant's hat on his head, the ultimate humiliation for an archbishop, and then they married him to a mare. They forced him to sit backwards on the mare. They paraded him through the streets of Novgorod, accompanied by jesters and minstrels, entertainers that the church had banned as pagan. The message was clear: your authority means nothing. Your God has abandoned you. Pimen would die in prison a year later. But his humiliation was just the opening act. The massacre of Novgorod had barely begun. The Volkhov River runs through the heart of Novgorod. In January 1570, it was frozen solid, thick enough to support horses, thick enough to build on. The oprichniki cut holes in the ice. For the next 5 weeks, every day, sometimes several times a day, people were brought to those holes. Men, women, children, entire families. They were tied to sleighs, mothers with their children bound to them, and then the sleighs were pushed into the freezing water. The oprichniki patrolled the river in boats. Anyone who struggled to the surface was struck with axes or poles and pushed back under. Heinrich von Staden wrote, "All high buildings were torn down, and all the beautiful doorways, stairs and windows were destroyed. After the pillage of the monasteries, the sack of the city began. Nothing was allowed to remain in the city, and everything that the soldiers could not carry away was either thrown into the river or burned. The women of Novgorod suffered especially. The chronicles describe it with cold precision. The wives of the executed had their hands and feet bound, their children were tied to them, and they were thrown into the water. Wives, children, bound together, drowned together." Ivan set up his headquarters at Gorodishche, the ruins of an ancient fortress on the outskirts of Novgorod. According to legend, this was where Rurik, the founder of Russia, had first established his rule over the Slavs. The symbolism was deliberate. Ivan saw himself as Rurik's heir, bringing order to a chaotic land. The fact that his version of order meant mass murder didn't trouble him. From Gorodishche he conducted trials. The word trial is generous. Prisoners were brought before Ivan, nobles, merchants, clergy, and accused of treason. The evidence was irrelevant. The verdict was predetermined. The only question was the method of execution. Every day 500 or 600 people were killed. Some were drowned, some were roasted on specially constructed iron pans, some were impaled, some were torn apart by horses. Ivan watched. Ivan participated. Ivan prayed. One of the most disturbing accounts comes from the chronicle's description of what happened to the women of a boyar named Ivan Petrovich Fedorov. Fedorov had been one of Ivan's most trusted advisors. He had helped govern Russia when Ivan was away at war. He was, by all accounts, a good man, honest, pious, fair to the peasants on his estates. Ivan had him killed anyway, probably poisoned, definitely tortured first, but the Tsar wasn't satisfied with killing one man. He wanted to destroy everything Fedorov had ever touched. The chronicle records, the women and girls were stripped naked and in this state would be forced to catch chickens in the field. Catch chickens. Naked. In the Russian winter. This wasn't murder. This was performance art. Ivan wanted to humiliate these women, wives, daughters, servants, before he killed them. He wanted to reduce them from human beings to animals, scrambling in the snow for the amusement of his men. The chronicle doesn't tell us what happened to those women afterward. It doesn't need to. After the initial massacres, Ivan decided he needed some fresh air. He embarked on a tour of the monasteries around Novgorod, the ones whose monks and nuns he had already murdered. But the buildings themselves still stood. The treasuries hadn't been fully emptied. The granaries were still full. Ivan personally supervised the looting. Icons, bells, sacred vessels, centuries of devotion melted down and carted away. Robert Payne describes it. He spent a day in each monastery superintending the removal of costly fabrics, sacred vessels, icons, bells, and whatever else he could lay his hands on. His rage for destruction extended to the granaries, which were burned, and all the horses and cows belonging to the monasteries were slaughtered. He didn't just kill the people, he killed the memory. Every book was burned, every record was destroyed. The goal wasn't just to punish Novgorod, it was to erase it. How many died at Novgorod? The sources disagree wildly. The first Peskov chronicle claims 60,000. The official oprichniki records' Ivan's own count list about 1,500 big people, nobles, and roughly the same number of smaller people, commoners. Modern historians, looking at the population of Novgorod after the famines and plagues of the 1560s, estimate the city probably had only 10,000 to 20,000 residents. They suggest the death toll was somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 from direct violence. But those numbers don't include the monks and nuns from the surrounding monasteries, nearly 500 killed in the first days alone. They don't include those who died later from starvation, exposure, or disease after their food was burned and their homes destroyed. They don't include the thousands who were simply deported, marched into the wilderness with nothing, never to be heard from again. The Synodicon of the Disgraced contains 3,300 names, and that's just a fragment of Ivan's total record, covering only certain years. The truth is, we'll never know the real number. Ivan destroyed the records along with the people. By mid-February, Ivan decided he was finished. Not because he felt remorse, not because anyone stopped him, simply because there was nothing left to destroy. He summoned the survivors, what few remained, to a gathering. According to the chronicles, he offered them forgiveness, "I pray to God for your prosperity," he supposedly said. "Pray to God for us." Then he rode away. Behind him, he left a city that would never recover. Novgorod had been one of the great cities of medieval Europe, a trading hub, a center of culture, a repository of centuries of art and learning. After January 1570, it was a graveyard. The merchants were dead or fled, the monasteries were empty, the Cathedral of St. Sophia stood stripped of its treasures, its ancient doors ripped from their hinges, and the convents, the sisters who had prayed there for generations, gone, all of them, beaten to death, drowned or scattered to the winds. Mother Euphrosyne, Sister Xenia, Sister Pelagia, Sister Martha, we don't even know their real names, only that they existed, only that they prayed, only that they died. Subscribe to the Hollow Throne. Help us remember the ones history forgot, because some voices deserve to be heard, especially the ones that were silenced. The massacre at Novgorod was not an isolated incident. It was the climax of a campaign that had been building for years and would continue after. Before Novgorod there was Tver. After Novgorod, Ivan planned the same fate for Peskov until, according to legend, a holy fool warned him that he would die if he harmed the city. But across Russia the pattern was the same, oprichniki arriving at monasteries and convents. The looting, the humiliation, the murder. Heinrich von Staden's memoir tells us, there are 300 monasteries inside and outside the city and not one of these was spared. There's another pattern in Ivan's treatment of women, one that's often overlooked because it seems almost benign compared to the massacres. Forced tonsuring. When Ivan wanted to be rid of a woman, a wife, a daughter-in-law, a political rival, he didn't always kill her. Sometimes, he made her disappear in another way. He sent her to a convent. This was legal in 16th century Russia. A man could divorce his wife by forcing her to take religious vows. She would have her hair cut off. She would take a new name. She would be dead to the world, legally, socially, spiritually. Ivan did this repeatedly. His own son's first wife, Elena Sheremetova, was sent to a convent because she failed to produce an heir. His son's second wife, Feodosia Solovaya, suffered the same fate. His sixth wife, Vasilisa Melentieva, was sent to a convent after Ivan discovered she had taken a lover. The lover was impaled under her window. His fourth wife, Anna Koltovskaya, was sent away after only a year. But here's the twist. She survived. She outlived Ivan by decades, eventually becoming a respected abbess. She saw the time of troubles. She saw the rise of the Romanovs. She proved that the convents Ivan used as prisons could also be sanctuaries. But Ivan's destruction wasn't limited to Orthodox Christianity. In the Livonian War, his 25-year campaign to conquer the Baltic, he encountered something he hated even more than independent-minded Russian nuns: Catholics. The Livonian Confederation, modern-day Estonia and Latvia, was home to Catholic monasteries and convents that had stood since the crusading era. They were wealthy, they were powerful, and they were, in Ivan's mind, heretics. When Ivan's armies invaded in 1558, they showed no mercy to religious institutions. At the siege of Dorpat, chronicles record the massacre of 10,000 people. The monasteries and convents were among the first targets. Their treasures were seized, their residents were killed or enslaved. For the Catholic nuns of Livonia, the horror was doubled. They were not just targets of political violence, they were heretics in the eyes of their attackers. Their faith was false, their prayers were worthless, their suffering was deserved. The Livonian War would last 25 years. Ivan would ultimately lose, forced to surrender all his conquests. But the convents he destroyed never came back. Modern historians estimate that only 10 to 25% of Estonia's population survived the 60 years of warfare that Ivan's invasion sparked. Among the victims, every Catholic religious house in the region. Ivan lived 14 more years after Novgorod. He remarried multiple times. He continued his wars. He continued his persecutions. But something had broken in him, or perhaps something had finally crystallized. In 1581 he killed his own son, the heir he had raised, the prince who had proven himself loyal, dead by his father's hand in a fit of rage. The painting by Ilya Repin, Ivan the Terrible and his son Ivan, captures the moment. The Tsar, eyes wide with horror, cradling the body of the son he has just murdered, blood seeping through his fingers. Some historians think this is when Ivan finally understood what he had become. Others think he never understood at all, that he mourned his son the same way he mourned his victims, with genuine tears and sincere prayers, never connecting his grief to his own actions. In his final years, Ivan compiled the Synodikon of the disgraced. He sent money to monasteries with instructions to pray for the souls of those he had killed. He died on March 18, 1584, while playing chess. According to one account, he was in the middle of setting up the pieces when he simply stopped. He had requested to be buried as a monk. The monastic robe was laid out for him, but by the time they tried to dress him in it, he was already dead. Too late for salvation, too late for redemption, too late. Ivan died, leaving Russia in ruins. His remaining son, Fyodor, was gentle and pious, utterly unfit to rule. When Fyodor died childless in 1598, the Rurik dynasty, the family that had ruled Russia for 700 years, died with him. What followed was called the Smutnoye Vremya, the time of troubles, 15 years of chaos, false tsars claiming Ivan's throne, Polish invasions, Swedish invasions, famine so severe that people ate grass and bark, and according to some accounts, each other. Russia almost ceased to exist. The terror Ivan had inflicted didn't strengthen his empire. It hollowed it out from within. He had murdered so many nobles, so many administrators, so many people who knew how to actually run a country, that when he died, there was no one left who could hold things together. The Oprichnina was long gone by then. Disbanded in 1572, its leaders executed by the same methods they had used on others. Even to speak the word became punishable by death. But the damage was done, and yet somehow the church survived. Not just survived, thrived. The monasteries that Ivan had destroyed were rebuilt. The convents that had been emptied were repopulated. The faith that he had tried to subordinate to his crown outlasted him by centuries. Metropolitan Philip, the saint who had refused to bless Ivan's terror, was canonized. His relics were brought to Moscow with great ceremony. His example became a model for resistance to tyranny. Novgorod never recovered its former glory, but it survived. The Cathedral of St. Sophia still stands today. The walls still bear the scars of Ivan's looting, but they bear something else too, the prayers of pilgrims who have visited for 500 years since. The convents were rebuilt. New women took vows where their sisters had died. The Jesus prayer was spoken again. Gospodi Jezusa Christe, Sign Boży, Pomiluj moje grzesznego. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Ivan wanted to erase these women from history. He burned their records. He destroyed their convents. He killed the witnesses. But he couldn't destroy everything. The Synodicon of the disgraced survived. Ivan's own confession, his list of victims that he thought would earn him divine forgiveness. The chronicles survived. The Novgorod Chronicle, the Peskov Chronicle, the accounts written by witnesses who risked their lives to document what they saw. The foreign accounts survived. Heinrich von Staden's memoir, the dispatches of ambassadors, the reports of merchants who had seen the aftermath and could never forget it. And in those documents, scattered among the lists of nobles and merchants and soldiers, are the nuns. Nuns from the monasteries of Novgorod. Abbesses and nuns shared the same fate. Nearly 500 monks and nuns beaten to death with clubs. They're still there in the archives, still waiting to be remembered. There's a prayer in the Orthodox tradition. 2 words, the simplest prayer in the Christian vocabulary. Gospodi pomiluj. Lord, have mercy. It's said during every service. It's the response to every petition. It's the heart of Orthodox worship, the acknowledgement that we are all sinners, all in need of mercy, all dependent on something greater than ourselves. Ivan knew this prayer. He said it thousands of times. He heard it sung in his chapel at Alexandrov Sloboda, where his monks turned murderers gathered every morning before going out to kill, but he never understood it. The nuns he killed, they understood. They had built their lives around those 2 words. Every morning, every evening, every moment of every day, Gospodi pomiluj, Lord have mercy. Not mercy for themselves, though they prayed for that too. Mercy for the world. Mercy for the suffering. Mercy even for those who hated them. We don't know what the nuns of Novgorod said as they died, but I think we can guess. Gospodi pomiluj, Lord have mercy. And if there's any justice, any truth to the faith they died for, then mercy was granted. Russia changed after Ivan. The Romanovs took the throne and held it for 300 years. Then came revolution. Then the Soviets. Then the collapse. Through all of it, the Orthodox Church endured, persecuted, corrupted, used, abandoned, but never quite destroyed. Today, in the rebuilt convents of Russia, women still take vows, they still wear black habits, they still pray the Jesus prayer. Gospodi Jezus Christ, Sign Boży, Pomiluj moje grzesznego. The same words, the same rhythm, the same faith. Ivan thought he could destroy that. He was wrong. So why tell this story? Why spend an hour and a half on a massacre that happened 500 years ago? Because the pattern hasn't changed. Tyrants still target faith. They still fear those who answer to something higher than the state. They still try to break the spirit before they break the body. And people of faith still resist, still pray, still refuse to abandon what they believe, even when it costs them everything. The philosopher Alexander Solzhenitsyn, himself a survivor of Soviet tyranny, wrote, "The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being." Ivan the Terrible proved that. He was capable of building churches and destroying them, of praying for the dead and killing the living, of weeping for his victims and ordering more executions. But the nuns proved something else. They proved that faith can survive terror, that the powerless can outlast the powerful. That even when everything is taken, your home, your community, your life, you can die with your soul intact. The bell that rang that morning in 1570 is silent now. The convent of the Intercession, if it even existed by that name, has been lost to history. But somewhere in the archives there's a line in a ledger, a notation in a chronicle, a name in the synodocon of the disgraced. Mother Euphrosyne, Sister Xenia, Sister Pelagia, Sister Martha. Names I've imagined for women whose real names we'll never know, but they were real. They lived, they prayed, they loved, and they died as they had lived, faithful. Ivan the Terrible's empire crumbled, his dynasty ended, his name became a byword for cruelty, but the prayer survived. Gospodi pomilui, Lord have mercy. If you listen, if you really listen, you can still hear them. You've just witnessed one of history's darkest truths. If stories like this remind you how fragile humanity is, how easily voices can be erased, then subscribe to the Hollow Throne, because some voices deserve to be heard, even if they were silenced centuries ago, especially then.